Good afternoon, I'm Bakir Sonova and you are watching A News. Let's see the top stories shaping our world. NATO leaders backed a significant increase in defense spending during the summit in The Hague. American President Donald Trump says U.S. to hold nuclear talks with Iran next week. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signs deal with the Council of Europe to set up tribunal crimes against Ukraine. NATO leaders have agreed to significantly increase defense spending following strong demands from U.S. President Donald Trump. At a summit in The Hague, the alliance reaffirmed its commitment to collective defense under Article 5.
At the NATO summit in The Hague, leaders from all 32 member states endorsed a major hike in defense spending, a move strongly pushed by U.S. President Donald Trump. The alliance approved a new target of 5% of GDP, including 3.5% for core defense capabilities and 1.5% for broader security infrastructure. The new targets mark a significant increase from the previous 2% goal and will be phased in over the next decade. In a 5-point declaration, NATO formally backed the elevated spending objective, a move aimed at satisfying U.S. calls for greater burden sharing, while also addressing European concerns over mounting security threats from Russia in the aftermath of its 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
The countries have to find the money. It's not easy. These are political decisions. I totally recognize that. But at the same time, there is absolute conviction with my colleagues at the table that given the threat from the Russians, given the international security situation, there is no alternative. We've got to do this.
However, the Kremlin has criticized the summit, accusing NATO of militarization and portraying Russia as a threat to justify the increased spending. President Trump declared the outcome a great victory and expressed hope that increased spending would benefit U.S. arms manufacturers.
This is a monument really to victory, but it's a monumental win for the United States because we were carrying much more than our fair share. It was quite unfair, actually. But this is a big win for Europe and for actually Western civilization.
However, Trump also threatened to impose harsher trade terms on Spain after its prime minister said Madrid could meet its NATO obligations without hitting the 5% mark. French President Emmanuel Macron raised concerns over proposed US trade tariffs, warning they could undermine allied cooperation. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte praised Trump's role, calling the alliance now stronger, fairer, and more lethal. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met Trump privately after attending the summit's pre-dinner, but was not part of the main session. Despite underlying tensions, leaders reaffirmed their unity under Article 5, declaring that an attack on one is an attack on all.
The next NATO summit is scheduled to take place in Turkey in 2026, and now there are more details about a plan aimed at increasing NATO countries' defense spending to 5% of their GDP, up from the current 2%. However, the new target will be measured differently.
NATO leaders have been presented with a new defense spending target at a summit in The Hague, as demanded by US President Donald Trump. The plan suggests that NATO members should spend 5% of their GDP on defence and broader security investments. This is a significant increase from the current 2% goal, which was set at a summit in Wales in 2014. However, the new target will be measured differently. Members will be expected to spend 3.5% of GDP on core defence, troops and equipment, which matches the old 2% criteria. An additional 1.5% of GDP would go toward defence-related areas, such as adapting roads, bridges, and ports for military use, cybersecurity, and protecting energy pipelines. In 2024, NATO countries spent over $1.3 trillion on core defence, up from about $1 trillion a decade earlier in constant 2021 prices. But if they had all spent 3.5% of GDP last year, total spending would have reached around $1.75 trillion. The proposed increase is driven by Moscow's ongoing war in Ukraine and concerns about future threats from Russia. Pressure has also come from Washington to boost spending, especially as Europe faces the possibility that the US could withdraw some troops and capabilities. Still, not every NATO member is on board. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez says his country can meet its military goals with spending at 2.1% of GDP. Spain approved the draft summit statement containing the new target, but made clear it will not spend that much. NATO officials say there will be no opt-out. Spain's spending will be tracked and, if it falls short, must rise. Britain, for its part, says it will overhaul its defence strategy to counter Russian threats, nuclear risks and cyber attacks by investing in drones and digital warfare rather than relying on a larger army. Responding to Trump's call for Europe to take greater responsibility for its security, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has pledged the largest sustained increase in British defence spending since the end of the Cold War. Compared to Russia, NATO countries spend a smaller share of GDP on defence, but collectively they vastly outspend Moscow. Russia raised its military spending by 38% in 2024, reaching about $149 billion, or 7.1% of its GDP, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. China, the world's second largest military spender, dedicated an estimated 1.7% of its GDP to defence last year. NATO members will be expected to meet the new target by 2035, though it could be reviewed and adjusted in 2029.
A new international tribunal will prosecute Russia's leadership for launching the war against Ukraine. It is the first such court established by the Council of Europe human rights body, operating outside existing legal bodies.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has signed an historic agreement with the Council of Europe human rights body to establish a special tribunal dedicated to prosecuting Russia for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The signing ceremony took place in Strasbourg, where Zelensky was welcomed by Council Secretary-General Alain Berset. Officially backed by European foreign ministers in May, it will focus on senior Russian officials who orchestrated the 2022 full-scale invasion. The Ukrainian president said the move sends a powerful signal that aggressive wars will not go unpunished.
This is a really truly very important step. Today we are launching the process to create a tribunal for Russia's crime of aggression against Ukraine. Every war criminal must know there will be justice, and that includes Russia. And we are now boosting the legal work in a serious way. There is still a long way to go. Politically, we have already made big progress, and I'm grateful to the Committee of Ministers, to the Council of Europe, and to everyone showing leadership.
Unlike the International Criminal Court, which lacks jurisdiction over crimes of aggression, this special court is designed to specifically target national leaders. This include acting or former presidents, prime ministers and foreign ministers who bear the highest responsibility for initiating war. This marks the first time the Council of Europe is establishing such a tribunal, which will operate independently from the European Court of Human Rights.
Ukraine and the Council of Europe are signing an agreement to establish the special tribunal for the crime of aggression. A tribunal to judge between victims and aggressors, between impunity and accountability, because without accountability there can be no lasting peace for Ukraine and Europe as a whole.
The International Criminal Court in Hague has already issued war crimes warrants for Russian President Vladimir Putin for unlawful deportation and transfer of children during the Russia-Ukraine war. However, this new court will address the core act of launching the war itself. A dedicated registry has already documented more than 34,000 instances of war-related harm, including civilian deaths, torture, sexual violence and destruction, which may serve as evidence in future prosecutions.
EU leaders are meeting in Brussels to discuss key issues, including economic challenges, the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, European defense, migration, and Moldova's EU accession. At the summit, leaders will advise the European Commission on whether to accept a swift trade agreement with the United States on the terms favorable to Washington, or to continue negotiating for a better deal ahead of the 9th of July deadline, set by President Donald Trump. U.S. President Donald Trump stated on Wednesday that he is likely to seek a commitment from Iran to halt its nuclear program during next week's talks. Trump, who helped negotiate the ceasefire, told reporters at a NATO summit that he was not particularly interested in restarting negotiations with Iran, insisting that U.S. strikes had destroyed its nuclear program. Iran hasn't acknowledged any talks taking place next week, though U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff has said there has been direct and indirect communication between the two countries. A sixth round of U.S. Iran negotiations was scheduled for earlier this month in Oman, but was cancelled after Israel attacked Iran. In the aftermath of the 12-day conflict and the fragile ceasefire brokered by Washington, a new diplomatic chapter may be unfolding. The United States and Iran are believed to be preparing for direct talks next week, a potential turning point in a crisis that has shaken the Middle East. But how willing is Tehran to truly negotiate, and what strategic leverage does it retain, despite reported setbacks to its nuclear infrastructure? To unpack these critical developments, I'm joined from Lisbon by Anna Evans, a political analyst with a focus on Middle Eastern diplomacy and transatlantic security affairs. Anna, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Anna, given the recent escalation and the reported talks on the horizon, do you believe Iran is now more inclined to accept a negotiated outcome?
Well, Bakhtiar, I would say that Iran is not in a very good position at this point. Iran has lost quite a lot of leverage, both in its systems for aerial defense, because it's pretty much dismantled, and in its nuclear operational capacity, if we might say that. So at this stage, although there is the knowledge to keep on a nuclear program, the industrial logistics that were related to this program have been significantly damaged. And so that places Iran in a position where it really does not have a lot of strategic leverage. Also, I would say that Iran is facing domestically a risk of dissent and some fragmentation within the Revolutionary Guards. And so both internally and externally, the country has become somewhat vulnerable, if we can put it this way, in terms of the regime, the political regime. When I say the country, I'm just referring to the regime because I love the Iranian society, so it's two different issues. Now, I would say that Khamenei, the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, is treading on a very fine line because, you know, very public negotiations at the diplomatic level in a framework where the country has revealed vulnerability would not be very beneficial in domestic politics, in terms of domestic strategy. So the regime needs to find a very delicate balance between what can be known publicly with regard to negotiations and what can be done more secretly, if one can put it this way. So I'm not quite sure that publicly there will be any kind of major concession or major commitment to stop a nuclear program. And I think one important aspect that perhaps people don't talk sufficiently about is that, Iran has developed its nuclear infrastructures in a highly guarded and secretive and bunker fashion. If these infrastructures were civilian infrastructures, there would be no need to be that secretive, that protective, and you know, that bunkerly like in terms of a model of development. So the fact, you know, all the secrecy surrounding, all the lack of transparency is one more data that can tell us that this was indeed a military program and not a civilian usage, a purely civilian usage nuclear program. And so, you know, Ayatollah Khamenei is now threading this very dangerous threshold, and he cannot make concessions very publicly because he risks looking too fragile for his domestic constituencies. But in terms of its external position vis-à-vis Israel and the United States, Iran is rather fragile as well.
Anna, from a European perspective, how is the EU likely to respond if negotiations resume? Is there still space for a European mediation role?
Well, Europe is always ready and available to be a mediator. And as an organized framework of 27 states, which is what we are, a very, very fine and developed regionally integrated bloc, you know, both in terms of its supranational entities and also in terms of the major national leaders. For example, you know, Britain, France, Germany, you know, I think Europe has always made clear that it is always available to lead processes of mediation that can bring to peace or to a sustained peace, which is what one is looking for in this situation, because we know ceasefires are very easily detracted. It is very common that ceasefires are subject to very quick and easy attacks that then crumble the situation, you know, the agreements. And what Europe would like would be to have a sustained peace. And Europe is always ready for that. Now, if Europe is the right actor to do so, that is something that only the two involved parts or the three involved parts, i.e. Iran, Israel, and the US, can decide, because the mediators must be chosen and must be trusted by the parts that are involved in the conflict. So it needs to be the parts choosing who they want as mediators. And in that, Iran has, of course, a very clear word and position with regard to the choice. Iran, without Iran's agreement, there is no mediator.
Anna Evans, thank you very much for talking to A News. We truly appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
President Donald Trump is doubling down on claims that U.S. strikes on Iran obliterated the country's nuclear facilities. That's despite a preliminary damage assessment from the president's own intelligence agency, which was leaked to the media, suggesting that the airstrikes did not destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities and may have only set the program back by a few months. Tony Waterman has more from Washington, D.C.
These certainly aren't the headlines President Trump was hoping to make while at the NATO summit in the Netherlands. He was hoping to take a victory lap after those surprise airstrikes this past weekend, in his words, completely and totally obliterated Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities. But he's instead been left defending those claims after this leaked U.S. intelligence report found that key components of Iran's nuclear program, like centrifuges and highly enriched uranium, are still largely intact, and that Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon was likely set back by only a few months. The assessment also reportedly found that those bunker-busting bombs didn't cause as much damage as expected, something that Israeli intelligence has also concluded. When asked about this assessment by reporters, Trump tried to cast doubt on the U.S. intelligence, saying that it was inconclusive, that he believes it was total obliteration, and he insisted that Iran's nuclear program has been set back by decades. Trump's team, including the U.S. Defense Secretary, have claimed that this is all politically motivated, that the leaked report is meant to, in their words, demean President Trump and discredit the brave fighter pilots who conducted this mission. And it's important to remember that this is just a preliminary report by just one of the many branches of the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and it's mostly based on aerial satellite images. There aren't agents on the ground jumping into those holes left by the bombs to assess the internal damage at these facilities. So it's still very early in this damage assessment, and things could certainly change going forward. Tony Waterman for A News, Washington.
French President Emmanuel Macron and the International Atomic Energy Agency Director Raphael Grossi met in Paris to discuss the status of Iran's nuclear program. The meeting focused primarily on the radiological risks following the airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities and how the IAEA can respond. Steps to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons were also discussed. Iran's parliament has voted to suspend cooperation with the UN's nuclear watchdog, accusing it of failing to condemn recent strikes on its nuclear sites. Our correspondent Turaj Shirali-Low has more from Tehran.
Just a day after the ceasefire, Iran's parliament on Wednesday voted for suspension of the Islamic Republic's ties with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Speaker Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf said that cooperation with the UN watchdog will be suspended due to its failure in condemning the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran's civilian nuclear facilities, and that Iran will speed up its nuclear program for peaceful purposes. Tehran has also said that it will lodge a legal complaint against the IAEA Director General, Raphael Grossi, for his false reports about Iran's nuclear program, which were used as a pretext for the attacks. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, in an interview with the London-based news outlet Al Arabi Al Jadid, said Tehran's approach to the Non-Proliferation Treaty may undergo a change, but he did not clarify in which direction. Prior to the attacks, Araghchi and the U.S. negotiator Steve Witkoff were due to talk over Iran's alternative proposal to the U.S. draft agreement, suggesting enrichment by a consortium of regional countries. Since April, Tehran and Washington held 5 rounds of indirect talks for removal of the U.S.-imposed sanctions. Their discussions were disrupted by Israel's attacks against Iran on the 13th of June. Despite of the U.S. involvement in the Iran-Israel war and its attacks on Iran's major nuclear sites, Witkoff told the Fox News that Tehran and Washington were already talking to each other. According to the U.S. envoy, the talks were promising, and Washington was hopeful for a long-term deal after the ceasefire. Turaj Shirali-Low, reporting for A News TV, Tehran.
For the first time since last month's border flare-up, the defense ministers of India and Pakistan came face-to-face at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in China. India's Rajnath Singh and Pakistan's Khawaja Asif were seen touring the same meeting hall during the summit, alongside other regional leaders. since a main military flare-up between India and Pakistan in the disputed Kashmir region. Relations between the two nuclear-armed neighbors have remained tense. At least 6 people are dead after massive floods swept through southwestern China. Towns and villages along the Liu River are half submerged, and the tropical cyclone is expected to make landfall later today, adding to the disaster risk. Cleanup is underway, but emergency services remain on high alert for landslides, road collapses and dam overflows. Experts warn climate change is fueling more extreme weather, threatening millions and straining China's aging flood defenses. In France, a strong thunderstorm and heavy rainfall in Paris caused flooding on roads and railway tracks during Wednesday evening, closing some metro stations. Officials say at least 2 people were killed, strong gusty winds and hail being described as the size of tangerines damaged cars and buildings. Trees were uprooted and the temperature also dropped quickly by about 11.4 degrees Celsius in just 20 minutes. Storm suspended session in French Parliament as rain leaked into the chamber. The extreme bad weather came after a heat wave with temperatures of more than 40 degrees in some areas of the country. For the 3rd consecutive day, New York City faces an extreme heat warning, prompting officials to activate emergency plans as residents seek relief from sweltering temperatures. The city continues to cope with widespread impacts as this intense heat wave persists.
New York City remains under an extreme heat warning, with real field temperatures exceeding 37 degrees Celsius for a 3rd consecutive day. In response, the city has activated its heat emergency plan for the first time this year, while Governor Kathy Hochul has declared a state of emergency across 32 counties. Thousands of residents are seeking relief in cooling centres and public pools, while others have headed to nearby beaches.
Well, it was really hot, and yeah, we were just home, so I thought maybe the beach would be the best place because it's too hot to go to a bar.
I used to worship the heat back in the day, years ago, when I would tan for the beach and just lay out there and absorb the sun. But right now, I take care of my skin because it's very damaging, and it's just extremely too hot, and the heat seems to be worse from when I was growing up. It's a lot hotter, and it seems like it's dry, and it's just too intense.
The heat wave has already caused disruptions, with more than 6,000 customers in Queens left without power on Monday. Prolonged and extreme heat events such as this are becoming more frequent, widely attributed to the ongoing effects of climate change. However, rain and cooler weather are expected in New York City on Thursday.
Armenian security forces have raided homes targeting opposition supporters following claims of a failed coup attempt. Police reportedly searched properties linked to the Armenian Pan-National Unity Party, founded by fugitive ex-official Migran Pogosyan. Local opposition figure Seva Kachatrian said several residents were taken in for questioning. The investigative committee said it had disrupted an unconstitutional plot to seize power. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan blamed criminal oligarchic and clerical circles for what he called a massive and despicable attempt to destabilize the country. While the Armenian government maintains its safeguarding constitutional order, critics argue this signals a deeper crisis of public trust and democratic backsliding. So what does this moment tell us about Armenia's political trajectory? To unpack the implications, I'm joined from London by James Sharp, former British ambassador to Azerbaijan. Mr. James Sharp, welcome to the program.
Thank you. You're most welcome. Good to be here.
Mr. Sharp, let's start with the arrest itself. What message does the Armenian government appear to be sending by detaining Archbishop Galstyan and his associates? How significant is the Archbishop's role in the emerging opposition movement, both politically and symbolically?
Look, I mean, to be honest, we here in Britain think that British politics is very messy and chaotic. But when I look at what's happening in Armenia, look at Armenian politics, I realise that everything in Britain is very calm and peaceful. I mean, Armenian politics, I think, has long been very confrontational. And what we're seeing now, of course, is the run-up to the next parliamentary elections, which I think take place on the 7th of June 2026. And so all the things that are happening at the moment, the arrest of Galstanian, the arguments with the Catholicus, the attacks on the Russian-Armenian businessman Karapetyan, I think all relate to the forthcoming elections. And the opposition, Galstanian in the lead, appear to have decided that the peace agreement and Azerbaijani request for constitutional change are going to be like their core celeb. It's going to be the thing they focus on as a way of battering Pashinyan in the advance of the elections. So really the whole Azerbaijan-Armenia peace agreement seems now to be dependent upon Armenian domestic politics. And that kind of feels to me very dangerous. And, it's not often I agree with Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, but his comments that, they hope there's no new escalation between Armenia and Azerbaijan because the two countries are very close to finalising a peace deal, which is vital for regional stability and security. I mean, very wise words, I'd say. And I think every Western government would agree with that as well. I think, yes, Armenian politics is kind of very lively, if you like, and confrontational, but I think the risk of calling into question the whole future of the country and the peace agreement is actually quite a dangerous place to be.
Mr. Shab, how might these developments affect Armenia's regional posture, especially its delicate balancing act between Russia, the West, and its neighborhood?
I mean, it's very good questions. I talked about the Azerbaijan-Armenia peace agreement being sort of at the heart of the opposition's complaints and criticism of Pashinyan. But you've got the broader question there about what sort of Armenia do you want to be, really? And you've got a Pashinyan, whatever you think about him, and I know there are mixed views on him in Azerbaijan, but you have someone that at least is arguing for an open Armenia, a reformed Armenia at peace with its neighbours and integrated into regional and international structures, and benefiting from economic development. Whereas the opposition, they just seem to have a much more of a negative, backward-looking philosophy and vision, if you like, which then will leave Armenia as a country permanently in conflict with its neighbours, closed off from the world. So I think that every Western government would certainly very much support an open Armenia, reformed Armenia, an Armenia committed to a peace agreement with Azerbaijan. So as you were saying, mixed up with this to a certain extent is the question of Armenia's relationships with Russia and Armenia's relationships with the European Union, because there have been changes in that regard over the last year or so. And of course, relations with Turkey as well. I know Pashinyan was actually meeting Erdogan just very recently. So these international factors as well, I think, do play into the domestic political situation as well. But at the heart of it is what sort of Armenia do you want to be in the future?
Ambassador Shab, thank you very much for talking to A News. We appreciate your time.
You're always welcome.
Thanks a lot. Iran has reopened its eastern airspace and resumed operations at multiple airports following a 12-day closure during the conflict with Israel. According to Majid Akwan, spokesperson for the Ministry of Roads and Urban Development, the skies are now open for domestic, international and transit flights. The reopening includes major airports in cities such as Mashhad, Zaydan, Chabar and Jazz. The Iran-Israel ceasefire is now in its third day, but uncertainty remains. As evacuations continue, both sides are trading blame for alleged truce violations. Zeina Farzadeh has more from Astara.
It is the second day of the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, but the situation remains uncertain. Both sides are now accusing each other of breaking the truce. Here, at the Astara border, crossing evacuation continues. The latest group of evacuees includes citizens from the UK, Germany, Italy, China, Japan, and beyond. These evacuations are being carried out with strict checks and proper documentation. Many people said they were thankful for the hospitality and good organization they found here. You can watch interviews with evacuees on our news report and on our social media pages. The ceasefire is officially in place, but people are still living, and the region is watching closely what happens next.
In what is being described as a historic milestone, Uzbekistan's president has made his first official visit to Mongolia. The two countries signed 7 agreements and pledged to dramatically boost trade, while also launching a new transport corridor through Kyrgyzstan and China.
According to the press service of the Uzbek president, this first official visit to Mongolia was described as a historic milestone in strengthening friendship and expanding cooperation between the two nations. At the heart of the talks was economic partnership. A trade house featuring a permanent showroom of Uzbek products has already opened in Ulaanbaatar, a real and walking platform for building stronger business ties on the ground. The two leaders also agreed on practical areas of industrial collaboration, where their economies naturally complement one another. These include joint projects in mining and mineral processing, agriculture and livestock development. In total, 7 agreements were signed. The presidents also agreed to increase bilateral trade by up to 20 times. In 2024, trade turnover reached $20.4 million. Another key decision was launching direct flights between Tashkent and Ulaanbaatar this fall. And as landlocked countries, Uzbekistan and Mongolia share a common interest in building reliable trade corridors. The two sides agreed to develop these routes jointly with the support of expert teams. And ahead of the visit, Uzbekistan launched a brand new international transport corridor to Mongolia through Kyrgyzstan and China. The first delivery made it to its destination in just 8 days after a 45-kilometer journey by road. The route presents some geographic challenges as parts of it pass through the Altai Mountains, reaching elevations of up to 1,500 meters above sea level. But despite the challenges, this alternative corridor could play a key role in regional logistics, cutting both delivery times and costs for Uzbek businesses looking to reach the Mongolian and North Chinese markets. Fariza Kalimurzina, A News in Almaty, Kazakhstan.
That's all we have for now. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to A News for more.